family comes from West Africa, and they immigrated from one of the countries that had a lot of history with Great Migration and how Black people adapted to new environments and expanded the culture. So I decided to make a project about the Great Migration to really tell the truth about a lot of things that we don't learn about in school, and really shed light on how influential Black people are without even recognizing it. Like, a lot of us take pride in our culture, whether we have issues at home within ourselves or just with our environments. We really let our culture take over and create our identities in different ways. So my mission was to really talk about the impact of the Great Migration, how it affects the Western world way more than people think, and show how Americans aren't aware of how it started and why African Americans escaped from the South. They try to escape from Black trauma, bigotry, racism, everything that they can think of, anything that you can think of that caused Black people to either be murdered in the most violent ways or to run away and try to find as much freedom as possible. So my vision is, as a young Black student, I've always wondered why my U.S. history classes never thoroughly explain what happened after slavery and what it was like for African Americans. I learned about Jim Crow and segregation, however, it felt like a whole section of history was missing. I asked my history teacher if she could explain why our history lessons were so vague on Black history, but there was no valid response. In my mind, I would constantly ask myself questions like, how did African Americans end up on the West Coast, in the Midwest, in Canada? Did many of them go back to Africa freely? All these questions motivated me to do more research and create a small platform where I could put all my knowledge together. The Great Migration is one of the most crucial explanations of how Black culture evolved across the Western world and displayed how African Americans adapted to different locations with the same initiative, freedom from the oppressor. So on my first page here, I took the time to find like a decent, accurate map of where the Greyhound buses were carrying different African Americans. As you can see, it carried all the way up to the north, led up to the west coast from California to Washington, went all through Texas, went all through Kansas, Arkansas, all those places. And it just really showed how spread out they really were, more than just different territories. African Americans have been traveling across state and border lines for centuries. Black people have repeatedly relocated themselves and their culture, whether due to captivity and violence or freedom and sacrifice. Today we see the influence of Black culture everywhere in the U.S. and other countries. However, we also know how every territory purposely shunned the Black community for years. To this day, African/Black Americans are not safe living in America, especially in their own environments, which is highly disappointing. Factors like redlining and gerrymandering can explain how after decades after African Americans escaped the South, they're still struggled with other discriminatory aspects of America. So I put the different maps and territories. I put context to how their new communities grew and adapted to a place so far away from the American South. Black Canadians like Lucy and Thornton Blackburn, a couple that escaped from slavery in Kentucky, and Mary Ann Shedd Carey, an anti-slavery activist, paved the way for more African Americans to settle in Canada. And then you have Liberia, which is my parents' home country. It has always been an independent country from day one. It's one of the first African countries to have independence without gaining it from any European influence. African Americans began migrating to Liberia after news spread that they could travel back to Africa freely. President James Monroe even supported the relocation of freed African Americans to Liberia and requested certain citizens to lead the groups back to America. But it wasn't easy. Much work and support had to be done for Liberia to receive recognition they deserve. Today it's still struggling to get global praise, but icons like George Weah, former professional soccer player and the current president of Liberia, and Telfar Clemens, the founder of Telfar bags, helped draw attention to the country. So whenever you think of a Telfar bag, think about Africa, basically. Other places like Mexico and England were also places where a lot of black people ended up, and it's not very talked about in our history, especially since it's not revolved around American history. In Mexico, a lot of black people, about 5,000 to 10,000, escaped from the south and settled in the Rio Grande Valley. Many groups traveled on foot, while others rode horses and snuck aboard ferries to access Mexican ports. Even Mexicans who lived in Texas helped African Americans cross over to their country. It's still unrecognized that there is Afro-Hispanic culture in Mexico. Between the natives and the formerly enslaved people, it was very different, but there's still evidence of African culture in their territories. In Great Britain, it was one of the first countries to abuse the transatlantic slave trade system. It has a massive record of slavery and relocation of formerly enslaved black people, but due to their size, it's not very known and it's rushed and censored. They don't like to touch upon how England and the UK have a lot of African American people settled in their countries and in their cities, and how they abused them for years and took advantage of all their hard work. Moving on to the last two places, Latin America and the Caribbean islands. Latin America also has its own Afro-Latino history and culture. Countries like Brazil and Guyana have huge Afro-Latino populations. Slavery in Brazil didn't end until 1988 because it was the heart of their economy. It was widespread because the Portuguese who immigrated there carried more enslaved people to Brazil, and they brought over 5 million Africans that were captured, and they brought them to the country. The Brazilian society accepted slavery as a normal thing until the Princess Isabella, I'm going to butcher her name, Barganca, signed the Golden Law, which abolished all types of slavery in the country. The Caribbean islands is another place that highlights a lot of black culture as well, since most of their countries have a lot of African descent, and they also put their own culture they also spread their own culture out to the world. Most of the enslaved people were carried by the British and the Portuguese. They were forced to do labor like mining, planting, and harvesting sugarcane, weeding, and taking care of livestock for their owners. Slaves in countries like Haiti, Jamaica, and Dominican Republic fought for their independence for decades. These areas also have the most slave populations and plantations. The Haitian Revolution was one of the most prevalent movements in the Caribbean. They fought hard to gain their independence from the French and had courageous black soldiers too. The Caribbean has a mixture of African, Spanish, Indigenous, and European cultures, which makes many aspects of the country very diverse. Brilliant people like Celia Cruz and Francantini have brought massive attention to the Caribbean. So I spoke about the Midwest first because it was one of the areas that have not had a lot of recognition. African Americans started moving to the Midwest after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era. It was very difficult for families that didn't have cars, trains, boats, and Greyhound buses because of low finances and safety. So they took advantage of the routes and they just walked on foot. Many posters, like the one in the picture, and announcements were made to spread the news and attract as much black people as possible, but the main goal was for African Americans to move safer and more equipped neighborhoods. During the first phase, black migrants stayed in cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, and Little Rock, Arkansas. Most of them lived in the urban cities to improve their lifestyles from Jim Crow and take advantage of the industrial services. And during that time as well, thousands of white men had to join the military to go to battle in World War I. So it gave them more opportunities to get more established jobs, specifically the black men, to get more established jobs for their families. While gaining and working in factory jobs helped them, to a certain extent, it also caused issues as well. Just like the one in the picture, posters were shared with the black communities to take part in the Great Migration. Riots again, but there wasn't a positive reaction from the white Midwesterners, causing a lot of racial tension. The East St. Louis riots were one of the most horrible events that took place due to the violent racism. On July 1st, 1970, rumors broke out that a white man had been murdered by a black man, which erupted a lot of racial tension. After the news spread, a bloody racial riot took over St. Louis, and it resulted in drive-by shootings, beatings, arson attacks that were all directed towards the black community. The riot lasted for a week, killing 9 white men and hundreds of African Americans. There was also intense property damage, costing up to $400,000. The riot's aftermath caused over 6,000 black residents to run away from St. Louis for safety. But after the riots, more riots and massacres, like the Chicago race riots, the LA massacre, and the Ohio race riot in 1999, took over the Midwest. But despite all the violence, African Americans were able to make their talents shine. The Chicago Black Renaissance responded to the struggle and the pain the black migrants were facing. It highlighted black joy and creativity in the Midwest and acknowledged urban African American art, blues, dance, theater, and literature. Although it's unrecognized in history, they developed more racial pride and were motivated to uplift their communities through political activism. Black communities built institutions that sponsored artists, poets, and musicians, and frequently held lectures and discussions. Theater and art presentations were put on display for hundreds of African Americans and even gained attention from neighboring cities. Music genres like jazz, blues, and gospel became popular within the community and inspired black artists. The Southside Writers Group, that was founded by a group of black Renaissance writers in the 1930s, provided necessary feedback to forthcoming Renaissance writers so that they can improve their talents as well. The next area was the North in Canada. Hundreds of black people moved to states like New York and Pennsylvania and settled their families for freedom. The North had many manufacturing factories and industries that they took advantage of. While they were still working under authoritative white men, it gave them better opportunities to finally build their wealth. The North was different from the South. However, African Americans still dealt with segregation, prejudice, hate crimes, and more. The communities were more established and city-oriented compared to the South. And running small businesses and industries were common, so black icons like Madam C.J. Walker caught on to the big business scheme fast and built her multi-million-dollar natural hair business. Similar to the Midwest, they traveled to cities like Manhattan, Harlem, Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Philly, and Baltimore. When they arrived, they tried to adapt to the New England lifestyles. They were no longer in the South on farms and plantations. They were settled in cities and apartments with multiple people in one unit. There was no more open land and backyards, and purchasing property was way more expensive. African Americans still encountered violent racism, police brutality, and segregation, but there was no escapes in schools, workplaces, and even in their neighborhoods. The government even plotted a new method to separate them from white people in their area, which was redlining. If anyone knows what redlining is, it's when the government made a plan to separate the black and white communities, or the minorities in a sense, from the suburbs. So they drafted new district maps, and they took records of different cities that they chose that were class A or grade A, and the ones that were grade D did not receive a lot of attention and were often abandoned and became ghettos. So if you were black or an immigrant from another country, specifically Europe, you were most likely living in a grade C or grade D area, and you had a lot of health issues, and you did not live in the best areas. They gave a lot of low income and they gave a lot of low income resources to those areas because they felt like they didn't have potential to be up to the white standard that they wanted, or the American dream that they thought of. So during World War I, there was a lot of labor shortages. So industries in the North suffered, and many businesses were desperate, so they hired more and more unskilled black people. In the North, they adapted to the public school system, had better jobs, and they tried to adapt to the New England lifestyle and had easier access voting. However, not every opportunity brought good fortune. Duke University Seth Sanders said in an interview, "We thought what we would find was that the migration north extended life and made the African American population healthier. We actually found the opposite. Urban life is stressful. Being away from your roots is probably stressful. Many African Americans lived in segregated areas or ghettos to separate migrants from the classic American dream, and they even struggled to adapt to social norms from the Black establishments in the North. Northern Black communities looked down on them because of their Southern mannerisms. They supported, Black people supported themselves and also had other support from other Black people in the North. While some of them criticized Black Southerners for their country attitude, others supported them. Posters and maps with routes were designed to lead up to different cities, and Greyhound buses and trains followed the routes carefully. African Americans let their culture expand across the North. Black New Yorkers wanted to defy the stereotypes and show their haters that they were gifted and creative. So the Harlem Renaissance was one of the most inspirational times for Black people who wanted a career in the arts to strive to make a change. It was one of the first golden ages during the first phase of the Great Migration that focused on Black excellence. Organizations like the NAACP supported the Renaissance and promoted Black artists and activists who stood out. Black icons like Langston Hughes and Josephine Baker made a name for themselves during the Renaissance due to their creativity and their knowledge. In the West, it was set back for them. They migrated during the Second Great Migration, which was from the 1940s to the 1970s. They moved to cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, San Francisco, and Portland. It wasn't as urban as the North, but it had similarities to the South. Sharecropping, which is when the African American slaves would do labor in exchange for land and money from their owners to have some type of settlement, was declining. So landowners and workers started migrating to the city, and factory jobs became more common. Black people did manual jobs like digging ditches, scrubbing toilets, laying bricks down, washing clothes, and shining shoes. In the Los Angeles area, there were a lot of native Mexicans and Mexicans of African descent residing in the area, and both minority groups were separated from the predominantly white areas, so they stayed in neighborhoods close to each other. Many African Americans had pride in their homes, communities, and jobs until local white communities became intimidated by their growth. The ones who moved west had transportation available in very small ways. They came from Dallas, New Orleans, and Atlanta and traveled on horseback carriages and cars or just walking by foot in large groups. Many were unprepared for the journey, causing their health to decline. The West also dealt with a lot of violent riots. The success and positive growth that benefited the Black community on the West Coast infuriated the predominantly white areas. They didn't want to integrate with the Black neighborhoods and refused to engage with them on all terms. Neighborhoods in Los Angeles and San Francisco faced a lot of redlining to prevent African Americans from moving into their suburbs with the wealthy white residents. Police brutality also became more common across Southern California to maintain the division between Blacks and whites. The Watts riots of 1965 is an example. The riot started when two Black stepbrothers were pulled over in Watts by a white highway patrol officer in August 1965. Their names were Marquette and Ronald Fry. They were pulled over and the officer did a drug and alcohol test on the brothers out of suspicion, and Marquette's test came out positive. Angry over his arrest, Marquette resisted one of the officers, and his brother Ronald jumped into the fight to protect him. A big crowd surrounded the scene, and the Fry brothers were injured by the officers and arrested. Marquette was knocked out by one of the officers, and Ronald was hit with a baton in his stomach multiple times to stop him from resisting as well. Their mother, Raina Fry, pulled up to the scene to defend her sons, but eventually got arrested trying to protect them from the officers' attacks. The crowd that was surrounding them united into a massive riot against the officers and sent out a full attack. Rocks, bricks, and bottles came flying at people passing through the location, and more officers with weapons flooded the neighborhood. The riot lasted for 6 days, involving 34,000 people, and the aftermath resulted in 34 deaths, 1,032 injuries, and 4,000 arrests. The riot also left Los Angeles in debt of $40 million. Throughout the second phase, the Black influence in the music and acting industry increased. The success for Black artists and musicians brought many positive reactions.
positive and negative. Many people were inspired by their hard work and their diligence, but others were intimidated by their high praise. Hundreds of Black people on the West Coast saw the success of their cultures in other places in the U.S. like New York and Chicago, and they wanted to create something of their own. Right after the Great Migration, Soul Train was formulated by a man named Don Cornelius. It became the first African-American musical variety television show, and Don paid serious attention to the media and advertising business to jumpstart his idea of Soul Train. Before heading into the entertainment business, he also worked in news and sports media. Don Cornelius knew he wanted the network to be a platform celebrating ordinary Black folks and praising Black celebrities. Don pitched the idea and WCIU TV promoted it. Soul Train started on a low budget, but it became a massive hit within the Black Hollywood. Cornelius became the most praised TV host while the show was running until he retired. Soul Train had an enormous impact on television media and even inspired other production executives to copy Cornelius' idea. Soul Train ran until March 25, 2006 due to decreasing TV ratings. However, it will always have a legacy in Hollywood and in the Black community. The last place I spoke about was Liberia. The country has a lot of underrated history, but I chose to highlight it enough for everyone to understand. So during the Back to Africa movement, multiple groups sailed on boats and ships to return home. It's uncertain if they really returned home to their original countries because there was no official record of their ancestries. Many African Americans were carried to countries that had former slave ports and they left them there, while others joined voyagers who wanted to travel to West African countries with no ties to the Europeans. So Liberia and Sierra Leone were selected countries that thousands of Black people immigrated to reclaim their culture. In Liberia, various groups came onto the Bassa territory and were encountered by the villagers. The most notorious person who helped out the African Americans